Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I'm not focusing so much on the weird, although there might be some unusual elements to the story, as I am focusing on the around part, stories from different cultures, different people. And today's story is all about a fishing village and the women who live in it. I am referring to Under Nushagak Bluff by Mia Hevner, which was published in 2019. For those who don't know, Mia Hevner is a multiracial writer and like civil engineer. She is part of the Yupik tribe, which is a tribe in southwestern Alaska, near Bristol Bay. And I say multiracial because she has Norwegian heritage, which is something that shows up in this story too, writing about what she knows. Maybe this is semi-autobiographical in some capacity. And the Yupik people are vaguely related to the Russian Siberian tribes and also the Inuit people. Among many other groups. And this is the first book that Mia Hevner has written, and what a doozy of an outing it is. Spoiler alert, I really enjoyed this. But she also does civil engineering in her spare time. She was able to... she was able to get her civil engineering degree and has spent her time trying to work on water rights in Alaska and getting clean water to the people. She believes that water is a human right, and I agree with her. So that's a really good work that she's doing. I don't really know too much else about Mia. It was hard to find information on her apart from maybe what I found in the About the Author section here, because she's a fairly recent author. But I do hope that she does indeed write more. And so now we can talk about this book. I will do a spoilery summary section, so I do recommend this book. So I encourage you to go out and read it, and then come back and check out what I'm saying here. And so without further ado, let's talk about this book. I will do, of course, the summary and a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Under Nushagak Bluff focuses on a couple generations of women. Anne Girl, her mother Marula, and her daughter Ellen. Anne Girl and her mother live in Nushagak Fishing Village, again in southwestern Alaska. They're part of the Yupik tribe, and this takes place in the late 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s. And at the start of the story, Anne Girl and her mother are trying to fish, but their skiff is stuck on another boat. This boat is owned by a man named John Nelson, who is from Washington, and he's not a very good fisherman. He came basically because he heard he could earn some money that way. But Anne doesn't really care. She's really attracted to John, despite the fact that her mother is discouraging her from having a relationship with him, because she doesn't feel he's very competent in anything and wouldn't be able to provide for Anne Girl. But despite that, once Marula dies, Anne Girl does marry John, and they have a somewhat healthy relationship at first, but it's clear that they're at odds with one another. They want two different things. Anne is more interested in fishing than anything else, and John seems intent on flying, delivering supplies all around Alaska, and Anne is just nervous whenever John isn't really around. Despite all of this, they do have a child named Ellen, who is Anne Girl tries to teach the ways of the tribe, but Ellen doesn't really listen, and she seems more intent on hanging out with a woman named Nora, who she views as more motherly, and she starts going to church despite the fact that Anne Girl doesn't really like that. And so Ellen and Anne begin to have a rift that continues through much of the story. Things are made worse when Anne Girl sees a bird fly into her home and die on the floor, and she views this as an omen. She stops staying at John's place and goes back to Marula's house, which is still part of the community in which Anne stays in from time to time. And they don't really live together. John tries to persuade her to come back. Even Ellen does, but but Anne Girl is intent on staying away for the time being. One night, it's pretty cold in Marulia's old house, and Anne Girl tries to keep comfortable by drinking liquor, whiskey, and she takes her clothes off and doesn't realize that she's becoming hypothermic, and she ends up dying in the process, which upsets Ellen and also John, but John seems to get over it pretty quickly, unfortunately. And over time, Ellen begins hanging out more with Nora, but she misses her mom, so her relationship with Nora becomes a little bit fractured. In addition, a cannery worker tries to sexually assault her, but she's saved by a bird, which she believes to be her mother. And the bird even talks to her at various points in the story, which could be in her mind, but it could also actually be happening. And Nora really discourages her. Nora is part of the missionaries who moved into this village. So Nora is trying to convert her and make her move away from her native lifestyle. But despite that, Ellen seems intent on fishing as well, and so she works to get a cleat that her mother wanted for the boat, and even one of her friends is sexually assaulted by the cannery worker that Ellen managed to avoid, and that puts a damper on their relationship for a few years. A short while later, John's plane crashes, but a local woman by the name of like sweet something, I forget her name. She nurses him back to health, and they have a bit of a relationship, which seems to disgust Ellen in a couple ways. And then as Ellen grows older, she has relationships with the fishermen, as do several of her friends. It just seems to be how she's sort of trying to meet her match and whatnot. But she also seems like she wants to escape this village. She can't really decide there. Eventually, Ellen becomes pregnant, and she decides that she's going to take the skiff and sail away. But we see throughout the story there are a couple of interludes of someone stuck on the reef near in the bay, which we eventually find out is actually Ellen. She's talking to the bird, which she believes to be her mother, and sort of coming to terms with with the guilt that she feels over her mother's death, how she felt that she was partially responsible since she crumbled up some warm bread that was meant for her mother. But the bird also notes that the mom, would have died regardless because she was stubborn in her ways and wouldn't have eaten the bread anyways if she had gotten it. And it seems like Ellen comes to terms with her guilt there and is able to move on. And she does decide to stay in the village and has Sarah. And as the story comes to a close, we see her passing on stories to her daughter Sarah, indicating that she seems to be happy, or that she's content and ready for her daughter to sort of learn the lessons that she didn't really learn, or just have a better life than she had. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with Under Nushagak Bluff. One of the themes that Heavener is working with here is that of generational differences. I feel like many authors, when they're talking about like these sort of family stories like this, East of Eden is a good example. Like you kind of have to focus on generational differences and define characters and establish maybe what they're trying to escape from generation to generation. And I think in this story, the town that they're in seems to be what they're trying to escape, but also could be a family anxiety about being stuck in one place and sort of living in a place that is slowly eroding and changing before your very eyes, and not feeling like you don't really belong in that area anymore. Like each woman in the Marula line, which I'm calling the family because I don't really see a last name there, like they strive to break away from the person who came before. Like Anne wants to get away from Marula. Marula seems to be very strict for the time that we know her, not really approving of Anne's choices, and Anne sort of rebels against Marula, marrying John in the process. And then with Ellen, you see her rebelling against Anne, not really wanting to fish, not really listening, not really caring about much about the tribe's ways, and wanting to eventually escape along with a number of her other friends. And so, like you see the differences form, and Heavener is really good at drawing up the comparisons and the behavior of these characters and who they are. There's an urge to rebel, essentially. A lot of characters rebelling in some form or another, with, again, Anne Girl choosing to marry choosing to marry John, and then Ellen choosing to hang out with Laura and kind of defying her mother, who doesn't really care for religion all too much. It's not, I don't think that Anne girl really believes in what Nora is telling her about God and Jesus and all of that, but it's a good way to kind of rebel against your mother and feel a bit more comfort that her mom might not be providing her. But it does seem like even with that urge to rebel, they're all stuck on the same path, forced to live in the same cycle, forced to live the same life without really getting away from any of the anxieties that the previous generation was dealing with. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. Anne girl bent down and pressed her forehead against Ellen's. For the first time in weeks, she looked into her daughter's eyes, and in their darkness she saw the same lonely path that Ellen would take, living on the shores of the Nushagak. Her daughter would learn the seasons and sing the same stories, but she would also be alone and somewhere between this world and Anne girl's world. Nushagak was going to change, and the cannery was going to outgrow itself. More people would move onto the beach, and everyone would forget that fishing was for food and that hunting and trapping were for food. And they would forget, but Ellen would try to remember, and she would be alone. And then she would have to leave just so she could keep the memory. And that's a really sad quote of what the future that Anne girl sees for Ellen. That in her rebellion, she's going to try to break away from Anne, but end up living the same life that Anne seemed to have lived, wanting to escape from this fishing village because it's slowly changing and morphing from the tribal area that it once was. And it's like there's no real escape from that except to leave, and Ellen's never really going to leave because what other option is there? You either leave the home that you know for somewhere that might be more hostile, especially because she's a native woman, or you stay there and kind of become accustomed to the sadness that's inside of you. This all raises a very important question. What can Sarah expect from the future? Because Sarah is Ellen's child. Is she going to have the same life that her mother had of wanting more but never being able to escape this place? Especially things are more difficult because much like Ellen, Sarah is biracial. She might have less of a connection to her racial heritage, especially as this sort of fishing villages becomes more white and less native or indigenous populated. It seems like it isn't really ending on a happy note, and I'll note more about that later for Sarah because she might be going through the same thing. How is Ellen going to avoid it? Mia doesn't try to answer that question. She leaves us with that uncomfortable feeling, which I do like there. Another theme of this story is restlessness. Anne girl is portrayed as anxious and rushing around. She doesn't like kind of sitting still. She's always out and about, going fishing. And even when she gets married, things aren't really made much better, which I'll note in a few moments. But allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. It was difficult for Anne girl to sit too long in one spot. She found that if her hands kept busy, then she felt better, calmer. But once they stopped, a rising anxious knot formed in her stomach that made her want to run to the place where the tundra met the blue sky, where there was an end to the earth. She was scared of the knot and always felt its presence, even during the summers when she was too busy fishing, berry picking, and gathering wood. And that's a really interesting quote because it gets at the underlying anxiety that Anne girl feels, the restlessness of her just wanting to run and run and run and never sit still because she might be left alone with her thoughts. And marrying John does bring some peace, as the narrator notes in the story, that whenever she's around him, she feels contented and she loves hugging him, and it's really wholesome there. But it doesn't seem enough for Anne girl because she still feels that anxiety. She still feels a desire to go fishing and not wanting to be left by her own devices. And when John goes flying, she can't help but focus on the skies and hope that he doesn't crash and die and leave her all alone. And I think a lot of that is born out of a sense of a fear of being left alone. That maybe she didn't get the love that she felt that from her mom, or maybe she got the love and that she didn't really feel connected to anyone else in this village because it was changing so rapidly. And John is maybe the only one who understands her. And so if he's gone and she's just left with Ellen, she really has nobody. And there's that deep-seated fear right there that Heavener is really good at getting at. And Anne Girl chooses to self-medicate in this story with alcohol, and it's not very helpful. In fact, it leads to her death. I do think that there's evidence of mental illness in this story, that perhaps Anne Girl has an undiagnosed anxiety disorder or something fiercer in her mind that especially wasn't going to get diagnosed in this small fishing village, but especially wasn't going to get diagnosed at the time, given that there was still a lot of work to do in the field of mental health in the 1950s and 60s. So unfortunately, something that was kind of persistent there, but no one ever really noticed or was able to put a name to. And even Ellen is not free from this anxiety. While Anne is alive, she feels some of that anxiety too. And even afterward, there's that persistent guilt that maybe she did something that led to Anne Girl's death. And so it seems like this anxiety is genetic, passed on from family member to family member. And again, you have to wonder, is this what Sarah's going to deal with? Or was Anne Girl sort of able to reconcile her own fears of staying in this town with finally, wanting to and raise a child in this village that seemingly understands her? I don't know. I think I think this is a very negative ending, and I'll elaborate on that in a few moments. There's a number of other great things about this story. There is a lingering colonialism in this story. The missionaries came to this village in order to colonize the village on behalf of the white settlers and whatnot, in order to claim some aspects of the land. Even the cannery is owned probably by non-native sources, and so it's taking a lot of money and resources out of this village, and it's probably depositing it into non-native hands. There's a sense of racism, especially with Nora and her husband Frederick. Particularly, what's interesting is after Anne Girl dies, they have a funeral for her, but Frederick is insistent that they do a Christian burial for her, even though Anne Girl wasn't Christian. So a denial of her heritage, a denial of her courage or her culture after her death, sort of noting how the missionaries' work is always to erase the individual, to erase the non-Christian individual in an effort to propagate, white supremacy and whatnot. So I do like those elements that Heavener touches upon, but doesn't really go into that great of detail about. I also like Heavener's ability to create a lively setting here. It reminds me a little bit of Cannery Row, which is another story about a cannery, and Tortilla Flat, both by Steinbeck. He does a great job of creating a lively, lived-in feeling for the setting of the story, and Heavener does that too. It feels like the villagers, as well as the busy fishing lake and Bristol Bay and all of that are very lived in, and it gets me, it allows me to imagine this story and really feel what these characters are feeling. There's also something to be said about the use of birds as symbolism in this story, as Anne Girl believes her mother to be a raven and that she'll be reincarnated into a bird after she dies, and how Ellen believes that her mother is a seagull after she dies, and that might happen the same for her. I don't know enough about Yupik culture to know if that's something that they believe and if there's some deeper meaning there, but it is present through the story, and it's worth noting. I also think that the chapter where Ellen crushes the bread that's meant for her mother it goes pretty hard. It made me feel a lot of emotions to see that these two people, like Ellen was so mad at her mother and frustrated with her not being in her life and providing her with guidance, that she reacted in anger in something that might have led to her death. And the guilt that she feels afterwards guides the rest of the story. And I think Heavener is really good at lingering there and building it up as well, and exploring that and how it affects Ellen throughout the story. I do think that the writing can be a tad bit repetitive here. A lot of focusing on fishing and just passages about fishing, and it feels like Heavener doesn't really have a point and is just trying to extend the story without going anywhere. So I think that's one of the downsides, and I do think it does need a stronger ending. I like the ending. I feel it hits pretty hard, but I think there could have been a little bit more oomph taking with the themes and whatnot and connecting it all together. I feel like some of it was dropped by the wayside, and it could have made this story from pretty great to exceptional. In my opinion, it just feels like that ending is missing a tiny bit there. And then the last thing I just want to note is the ending. Is this a sad ending? Like, what kind of ending does this story have? I think there's a lot worth discussing there. Because at the ending, like, it seemed like Ellen wanted to be free of this fishing village, to move on, knowing that this village was going to, change greatly and not match the world that she grew up in a way that sort of disregards her native heritage and the skills that she was taught with fishing and everything like that. But we see that she doesn't actually leave. She gets pregnant and has Sarah. So is this a negative, sad ending? Is this sort of Ellen giving up on her hopes and dreams and raising her child, and she's gonna feel unsatisfied and restless like her mother, and it's going to lead to either to her death or just a lifetime of woe and unhappiness? Is that something we can expect for Sarah? Just generations of women who are forced to see their culture kind of stripped away and replaced by this white hegemony or something like that, a world that they no longer recognize and are no longer prepared for, and they're losing aspects of themselves in the process. That's what it seems like Heavener is kind of leading towards. I think it's presented as a bit of a happy ending, but I don't think it's very happy. And I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of like how natives react to losing their culture and seeing as more and more of who they are and what they believe gets kind of torn away from them and tossed back at them for sale or something like that. And this is happening in Alaska, but you can see it happening all over the United States as well. So it's a lot to think about. It particularly kind of struck me pretty hard when I read it, because it didn't felt like a positive ending. It felt more of a sad reality that Heavener is kind of acknowledging here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Under Nushagak Bluff by Mia Heavener. A pretty solid book, pretty great as I said, but I feel like it could have gone a little bit further. That said, I do definitely recommend this. This was the book club read for my friend Bevan's book club. There's a link to the Discord in the description. If you're interested, let us know, and so that we can share the book with you and talk about it. I actually picked this book out. I recommended it to Bevan because it had good reviews and whatnot. And so I'm surprised that this was actually a rare win in terms of me picking out a book. Bevan was joking that I was going to be like, oh, I hated it, and then it would have been all my fault because I'm the one who picked it out. But I actually really enjoyed this, and I definitely recommend it to you out there. Let me know what you think about this book or my review in the description below. Always willing to have a conversation there. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, or subscribe so that other people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And again, join the Discord if you want to talk about this book club, or just movies or TV or whatnot in general. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and fishery cannery travels. Farewell.